Alright, so what you need to take away from this part of the lesson is that client-side validation is in two types, the built-in and also JavaScript. You can learn more about server-side validation as we dive into what happens after you submit a form. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to walk you through what happens. Make sure to give me a feedback on this presentation. I know English is not my first language, so we are all struggling to learn in English language. Given this, we'd like to take you further and then see what happens in the next couple of slides. So we'll be looking at processing form data next. So once the form has been validated on the client side, it is okay to submit the form. And since we covered validation in the previous presentation, we are ready to submit. So this presentation, this aspect of the presentation looks at what happens when a user submits a form. Where does the data go and how do we handle it when it gets there? We'll also look at some of the security concerns associated with sending form data. Basically, we have to have an understanding of server-side programming, basic knowledge of HTTP as well as HTML, which we are already familiar with. Now, the objective of processing form data that we are looking at is to help us understand what happens when form data is submitted, including getting a basic idea of how data is processed. I will not be able to cover much on this subject, but I'll leave a link for you below where you can go and read more, study more. So I'll briefly walk you through, and all these tutorials are found on the Mozilla developer website. There's extensive documentation on all these things, and good enough, if you follow through with 8 activities, you should be able to lay hands on some of these presentation on the Mozilla developer website. So let's take you straight to Mozilla, where we'll be able to learn a little bit more about server-side validation. First, let's discuss what happens to the data when a form is submitted. Client-server architecture. This is important. Pay attention here. At its most basic, the web uses a client-server architecture that can be summarized as follows. A client, usually a web browser, sends a request to a server, most of the time a web server like Apache, Nginx, ISS, Tomcat, etc. Using the HTTP protocol, the server answers the requesting that is coming from the same protocol. Now look at the diagram above. The client sends a request upon submission to the server. The server receives the request and sends feedback to the client via the browser. So an example of this is illustrated in the earlier presentation. So an HTML form on a web page is nothing more than a convenient, user-friendly way to configure an HTTP request to send data to a server. This enables the server to provide information to be delivered in the HTTP request. Note, to get a better idea of how client-server architecture works, you can read the server-side website programming first step module on this website. Now, on the client side, we have to define how to send the data. This has already been done during the process of forming or creating our form, our HTML form. Whenever that is done, we decide how this form will be sent, how data will be collected and sent. Right now, the form element defines how the data will be sent. All of its attributes are designed to let you configure the request to be sent when a user hits a submit button. When a user hits that submit button, it has already been configured. take that message, the content of that form, and forward it in some way to a server. Now, the means of that transport to transport the data that has been entered can only be achieved. And two most important attributes are action and method. The action attribute. The action attribute defines where the data gets sent. Its value must be a valid relative or absolute URL. If this attribute isn't provided, the data will be sent to the URL of the page containing the form, that is the current page. In this example below, the data is sent to an absolute URL, for example, http example.com. Let's look at this HTML code. The form element, form action. So here we use a relative URL. The data is sent to a different URL on the same origin. Find this example where it's sent to somewhere else. This is the code sent to a different page but on the same website. So when specified with no attributes, as we will see below, the form data is sent to the same page that the form is present on. Let's take note of this. It's important to specify a URL that uses the HTTPS, that is the secure HTTPS protocol. When you do this, the data is encrypted along with the rest of the request, even if the form itself is hosted on an insecure page accessed using HTTP. On the other hand, if the form is hosted on a secure page but you specify an insecure HTTP URL with the action attribute, all browsers display a security warning to the user each time they try to send data because the data will not be encrypted. Let's move a little faster. The method attribute. The method attribute defines how data is sent. The HTTP protocol provides several ways to perform a request. HTML form data can be transmitted by a number of different methods. The most common being the get method and the post method. So let's examine these two methods very briefly. The get method is the method used by browser to ask the server to send back a given resource. Hey server, I want to get this resource. In this case, the browser sends an empty body because the body is empty. If a form is sent using this method, the data sent to the server is appended to the URL. Now, let's look at the following form. In this form, you notice that the method to post the data that is contained in this form is the get method. Since the get method has been used, you see the URL www.foo.com say hi to mom appear in the browser address bar when you submit the form. That's exactly what will happen because it uses the get method. So the data appended to the URL as a series of name and value pairs. After the URL web address has ended, we include a question mark followed by the name/value pairs, each one separated by an ampersand. In this case, we are passing two pieces of data to the server. So let's look at the other method, the post method. Now, the post method is a little different. It is the method the browser uses to talk to the server when asking for a response that takes into account the data provided in the body of the HTTP request. Hey server, take a look at this data and send me back an appropriate result. If a form is sent using this method, the data is appended to the body of the HTTP request. Let's look at an example. In this example, the same form we look at in the get section above, but with the method attribute set to post. Now, when this form is submitted using the post method, you get no data appended to the URL, and the HTTP request looks like so, with the data included in the request body instead. The content length header indicates the size of the body, and content type header indicates the type of resource sent to the server. This is discussed extensively in the Mozilla developer website in subsequent chapters, and you can find this very helpful. So we're going to have a quick look at some practical way of processing data after it has been submitted. So for us to be able to accomplish this, we'll look at a few things. On the server side, how does the server retrieve data submitted via a browser? Now, what we need to understand is that whichever HTTP method you choose, the server receives a string that will be parsed in order to get the data as a list of key stroke value pairs. The way you access this list depends on the development platform you use and on any specific frameworks you may be using with it. Example, raw PHP. PHP offers some global objects to access the data. Assuming you've used the post method, the following example just takes the data and displays it to the user. Of course, what you do with the data is up to you. You might display it, store it in a database, send it by email, or process it in some other way. Let's look at this. The global $post variable allows you to access the data sent with the post method by name. Now, to access the data sent with the get method, we can use the $_get. So this is what the code would look like. This example displays a page with the data we sent. You can notice that whenever you have a web form and you have your client fill out either on the contact page of a website and they click submit, usually if it's a WordPress and the server end is built on PHP framework, so definitely what you will notice is that it will take the data submitted and post it to an email where it will be received by the owner. So some of these actions taken by the server helps us also know how server processes the data that is collected. Alright, so the next thing we want to look at is an example in Python. This example, not really much, but almost similar to the PHP. They are all very similar, just a few variables that are just different. So you can get an example of how Python processes the data that is submitted. So there are other languages and frameworks, and they process submitted data in just several different ways. So we can read more about the other frameworks and languages still on the Mozilla developer website, where retrieving processing form data is a key subject. So take for instance Django for Python, a bit more heavy weight than Flask but with more tools and options. Express for Node.js, Laravel for PHP, Ruby, and Rails for Ruby. It's worth noting that even using these frameworks, working with form isn't necessarily easy, but it's much easier than trying to write all the functionality yourself from scratch, and will save you a lot of time. So you can read more about server side, the security issues on processing form data